Time is inevitable. It is inescapable. And in the case of Helldivers 2 and Arrowhead Studios, time is something they just don't have the luxury of abusing. But as they're now days into their 60-day plan to try to save the game, time is a factor they can draw heavily on for studio inspiration and direction, or at least a portion of time. And I'm speaking of the past. Welcome to the channel. This is LtBuzzLitebeer, and what's truly interesting about this recent developer announcement, again asking for feedback and suggestions, is that the evidence is already out there. What the players truly want and need if the studio would just take the time to look for it, and if they care to see it for what it is. Today is all about saving time and saving Helldivers in the process. In case you are new here, consider hitting subscribe, as it's free and it really helps the channel get noticed in the far corners of YouTube. And while you're at it, ring that notifications bell to receive my future upload alerts. Both are greatly appreciated, by the way. And this one took me more than a few hours to research and compile, but here's a side of Helldivers we don't normally get to experience. When it comes down to player counts and overall player interaction with this game, it turns out that nerfing players' favorite weapons while also buffing the enemies around them is not what they want. And that's become almost a battle cry of divers, both new and old. On August 13th, just 1 week after the game's biggest ever update dropped with Escalation of Freedom, the dev team was reduced to yet another statement and admission of missing the mark, coupled with vows to re-examine, rework, and to rethink the very game itself. Now, the past 5 months have been a whirlwind of emotions for Helldivers, taking what was a gaming enigma included in discussions of Game of the Year for 2024 to now an all-out player rebellion and calls to just let it burn. Just let the bots take Super Earth and let's finish the whole damn thing up. Arrowhead Studios was writing the script to an incredible story of underdog now turned champion, and instead they decided to tear it up and flip this saga upside down, turning loyal players, over 12 million of them, into disgruntled and disgusted opponents in one of gaming's biggest ever fumbles. Now, as someone that has been around and covered gaming for a decade now, this is the kind of behavior you expect out of EA, Blizzard, and Ubisoft. Not Arrowhead and their overnight smash hit Helldivers 2, but here we are. The concern here is this unknown factor. What will Helldivers look like at the end of this 60-day developer resurrection? Will there be enough to save? If it does survive, what will that version of Helldivers look like? Will it be a sci-fi milsim, as developer comments have hinted towards? Will it be the gritty, chaotic, and comedic joyride it was at launch? Again, all unknowns in this equation. Now, in my past life, math was a daily routine, and when applied here, Arrowhead, through these proposed meetings and discussions, is acting like they're being met with this impossible equation. Even simple equations cannot be solved if you don't have any starting points, but in the case of Helldivers and Arrowhead, we have a huge cross-section of data, if you take the time to look, and more importantly, if you care to know the truth. Yesterday, I posted a community poll over on my YouTube channel asking, what and or where do you think the developers should concentrate first that would improve the game the fastest? Now, behind the scenes, I was already compiling my data, and I had a pretty strong indication where this one would land. And after 18 plus hours and over 10,000 votes, it turns out that weapon balancing for both buffs and greater selection is the overwhelming winner here, with nearly 68% of those votes. Who would have thought, right? And this desire to increase power levels while pushing back on studio-induced nerfs plays out time and time again within the Helldivers timeline, starting off with the game's launch. And yes, I know that we didn't see balance adjustments right out of the gate, but it's important to set the baseline for player counts, and in the case of Helldivers 2, it starts off at nearly 459,000 players. Impressive numbers, no doubt, especially when you factor in things like previous releases, studio size, and so on. The first signs of cracks within the foundation of this game start way back on March the 6th. And in the case of Helldivers 2, you just can't look at a single date and time. And this is down to the real-life conditions that a majority of the player base go through. Jobs, family, and a dozen outside factors limit gameplay time during the week, so in the case of trend lines, as it relates to Helldivers 2, you need to add on a few weeks of time for the changes to truly take effect before you can definitively say that a change either had a positive or negative effect, usually seeing its biggest results on the weekends. Now, from March the 6th up to the 21st, when we saw the first major crash in player counts, a lot took place in the live game. Patch 1.000.100 went live. It nerfed the incendiary breaker. It absolutely gutted the railgun, and it hit the recharge rates on the shield backpack as well. And so begins Arrowhead's campaign of meta busting, as identified by community manager Baskinator, with this announcement also on March the 6th. Quote, "Weapons that are both powerful and versatile become a no-brainer choice during the weapon selection phase. It robs you of your own agency, as stale meta builds force you to make an unfair choice between a fun weapon and an effective one." I would argue that we could have both, but let me continue on. In short, powerful weapons can't be too versatile. Versatile weapons can't be too powerful. Having said all that, after analyzing player feedback and the data we've collected over the past month, we found the three biggest offenders of that principle. I'd personally love to know what player feedback was being analyzed at this point, but so begins the pattern with Arrowhead. They release vague statements making reference to unknown sources, and absolutely no charts or details are ever published. Now, players started logging in on the 6th, and they began noticing the changes to their favorite loadouts, along with an unpublished change the studio had made to spawn rates, which had been secretly buffed in combo with this patch. Now, not only were players' go-to weapons not performing like they were used to, but they were also now dealing with far more enemies. It was an aggressive 1-2 combo the studio had just laid down on the player base, and with no believable reason as to why. Patrik Lasota, head of product testing at Arrowhead, then laid another revelation on the player base with his developer blog aimed at primary weapon power, also published on March the 6th, when he said, "Many have commented that they aren't powerful enough and are unable to deal with all the enemies either by the amount of ammunition required or their raw DPS. This is very much intentional. You need to rely on your stratagems and the stratagems of your team to deal with all the enemies effectively." If you've ever watched how an avalanche begins, it usually starts off with a very small pebble that breaks loose, and as it slides down the side of the mountain, it breaks a slightly larger pebble loose, and then that one pushes an even bigger one down the slope, and pretty soon you have an environmental disaster of unrivaled power. March the 6th was that first pebble in the Helldivers avalanche, and true to form, it took a little bit of time to form and the results to be fully realized. March the 8th comes around, the Helldivers liberate Tien Quan, and we get the XO45 Patriot exosuits. They've now hit the game proper, flooding the servers to the point of overload. March the 12th sees another large change to the game with reduced elite spawn rates on 7+ difficulty, along with the Charger meta being turned on its head with the reduction of armor on their heads, making them killable with a well-placed eat or recoilless to the dome. Within the game, the infamous TCS missions appeared and flying bugs were first spotted in the game and consequently denied openly by Johan over on Twitter. Continuing on, and March the 14th rolls around and the Cutting Edge Warbond goes live. Now, outside of the LAS-16 sickle, it's seen as very underwhelming. So beginning this trend of mediocre Warbond offerings. March the 20th arrives, another patch, scaling back the now out-of-control environmental effects, also reducing the secretly buffed patrol spawns and fixing the self-detonation issues with the exosuit missiles. This 2-week period ends with the developers fixing a game-breaking bug caused by arc weapons on March the 26th, and a major event in Helldivers lore, our deployment back to Malevelon Creek to retake that piece of historic soil on March the 27th. Overall, this sounds like an overwhelming amount of changes to the game, and believe me, It was, because that's how Helldivers actually used to be. Every day was something new. Another patch, a new enemy type showing up in the game, new this, new that, which sounds incredible, but the player counts actually paint a different picture. Now, I've said this in the past, to pay attention to what Arrowhead does, not what they say. And here, we can apply that statement into pay attention to what the players do, not what they say. During these 2 weeks, social media was ablaze with Helldivers everything. Helldivers propaganda broadcast, Helldivers fan art. I mean, it was insane to try to digest it all, but within the game, that avalanche had already begun. Again, pay attention to what the players do, not what they say. And here's where the numbers paint a slightly different picture for us. You see, on March the 6th, we saw a Steam player count of 335,000 players spike all the way up to 437,000 players on Saturday, March the 9th. That's just 3 days' time, as players' schedules freed up and they began logging in over the weekend. But by March 21st, just 2 short weeks later, and after all of these changes arrived to the game, player counts had plummeted down to 246,000. Yes, most games would kill to see player counts that high, but once you step back and you take in this 30,000-foot view, Helldivers had just shed nearly 200,000 players in a matter of weeks, despite a new Warbond releasing, despite the mechs first arriving in the game, and despite a new headshot charger mechanic being installed into the game. For me, looking over the changes and trends, that first Pebble was the Meta 3 being nerfed. Players felt betrayed, and it shows in the player counts and how many players were shed from the live game. Betrayal turned to disgust and rage when it was found that Arrowhead devs were even stoking those nerf fires, taking to Reddit to troll the community, beginning their post with, "I'm feeding the rage a little for my own entertainment here, just so you know." Now, there was an eventual apology from the dev and the CEO, and the entire account was deleted, but those whispers were starting to occur. Were the devs changing things just to hurt the overall player power fantasy? It's also important to give credit where credit is due, and beginning on April the 2nd through April 7th, we saw the strongest comeback in Helldivers history, taking the player counts from 229,000 up to an impressive 345,000. Now, all of this began on the 2nd with patch 1.000.200 that included a comprehensive list of buffs to underperforming weapons, with things like more damage for the AMR, more damage per pellet for the incendiary breaker, fire damage getting a massive buff by 50%, the Dominator received a buff, DMRs received some much needed love, medium and heavy armor would now mitigate more incoming damage, and the enemy damage stacking glitch, especially noticeable with rocket devastators one-tapping divers, was apparently now fixed. April the 3rd sees the much-anticipated release of the Fallen Heroes Vengeance Malevelon Creek Cape to commemorate our recent and glorious victory, and April the 4th sees gunships start to appear in the game. And don't forget that there was a massive push against the bots leading up to April the 7th with Operation Disassembly, as we just pushed the automatons completely off the galactic map. To a dev, these 5 days are the blueprint to saving what remains of the player base. Widespread weapon buffs, lore-building gifts, such as this Malevelon Creek Cape, and a community-backed push to rid the galaxy of the bots all contributed to what was the biggest and last major spike in player counts. If the devs are looking for data, if they truly care about the health of the game in terms of what the players like, these 5 days in Helldivers history are invaluable. From this point onwards, Helldivers falls into a player count nosedive, despite all the in-game actions that are occurring, as we see its second largest exodus of players ever, again compressed over a 2-week period. The bots have now somehow returned just 2 days after we rid them from the galactic map. Democratic Detonation comes in a few days later with the S-tier Eruptor, along with the player favorite Grenade Pistol. Factory Striders appear on April the 16th, and the now famous 2 billion bug count major order goes live on April the 18th. Both of those aforementioned events slightly pushed the player counts upwards, but whatever the game was able to achieve was lost tenfold at the end of April, and it was a case of one step forward, three steps back, as patch 1.000.300 dropped on April the 29th. As a player that has been with the game since the early days, April's last patch was difficult to digest. Despite seeing small buffs to a handful of weapons like sidearms and certain assault rifles, there were also puzzling nerfs to primary weapon mag counts. Hulks now required even more force to stagger, which directly affected the arc thrower's effectiveness versus this enemy type. Devastators could now fire even faster, Scout Striders were even tougher, and enemy patrol spawns were now modified to match party size, beginning a journey of this mechanic just being perpetually. This was also the patch where the Eruptor Ricochet mechanics were obliterated, leading to divers taking insta-deaths from the overwhelming incoming damage. Many players have claimed that SONY and the out-of-the-blue mandatory PSN linking shenanigans led to this massive decline in player counts, but Helldivers was crashing way before May the 3rd. I'm sure the SONY issue didn't help this downwards trend in players, but it wasn't the end-all, be-all of issues to point at, as the numbers clearly paint a different picture. Overall, May was not a good month for Helldivers, as May the 7th saw the absolute gutting of the player favorite Eruptor, and we also got Polar Patriots, another middling warbond, which went live just a couple days later on May the 9th. It took until May the 15th for the studio to finally acknowledge that their previous changes to patrol spawn rates had actually been unsuccessful. They had done more harm than good. May the 23rd saw the Emancipator exosuit's arrival in the game, instantly sparking off a controversy of how weak it was versus certain enemy types, especially heavily armored elites like Bile Titans, which it still is to this day. May the 30th begins the missions to destroy Meridia with Dark Fluid, followed by a developer message that they and the studio would be slowing down their pace of release for patches and future Warbonds. Lost in this swirling mixture of May was the news that Helldivers had sold over 12 million copies, and Johan Pilstead would now be stepping down as CEO to spend more time with the game's development cycle as the Chief Creative Officer, being replaced as CEO by Shams Georgiani. The hope was that Johan, who had shown positive interactions with player comments and player concerns, could turn the Helldivers ship in the right direction and get it back to the initial juggernaut it had shown to be at launch. Patch 1.000.400 went live on June the 13th with massive improvements and wholesale buffs to stratagems, reverts of patrol spawn rates, reductions to elite spawns, along with a finely fixed spear lock-on mechanic. This is the last time Helldivers flirted with 100,000 players on Steam, and despite the poor showing from the simultaneous release of the Viper Commandos Warbond, the sentiment within the player base was that there was finally someone in tune with the players' wants and desires, and we were going to be getting back to Helldivers 1.0 with more player power and tons of chaos. A day later, on June the 14th, we actually received the message that we had successfully avoided receiving the MD-17 anti-tank mines, instead choosing to save the children. And oh, by the way, a donation would be made to the Save the Children's Foundation in honor of our glorious victory. By the way, June is rather quiet in terms of Arrowhead news, as Arrowhead proper begins to take their summer vacations up until July the 23rd with the release of the Escalation of Freedom trailer, which currently sits at 2+ million views. Overall, community spirits are high. New content is coming, new difficulty levels, new missions, new enemy types, and we saw what having Johan at the helm produced in a previous update. Yeah, we were all kind of looking forward to this, and then August the 6th arrives. Escalation of Freedom is actually content light, and it's comboed with a total gutting of flame effects, making them nearly useless now in the game. More nerfs are here for the Ensign Breaker and Grenade Pistol, and oh by the way, the Laser Guard Dog Rover, along with the Commando, are now on the Arrowhead nerf chopping block, showing as bugged in their in-game effects. Escalation temporarily doubled the anemic player counts, but have now crashed back to dangerously low levels. In here as well are explanations from now Chief Creative Officer Johan as to the necessity of these weapon changes, and we also received a waste of a Warbond with Freedom's Flame, which came pre-nerfed, eventually leading up to a near full-scale player revolt, and we got this August the 13th statement from game director Michael, acknowledging the issues along with plans to rebuild the game over the next 60 plus days. Now, speaking in terms of Arrowhead, they have periods in this game's life cycle where it showed tremendous and explosive player counts, always coupled in tandem with large-scale player power buffs and new items entering the game, which one would think that by this point in time, they would see that trend and make every attempt to embrace it with as much frequency as possible. As I begin to wrap this one up, and this is me just freehand, speaking my mind here, no script available, and I've been around games that have started off with great bones and intense player support, and I've steadily watched them crushed under their own creation, all in the name of developer spreadsheets and arcane needs to balance just for the sake of balancing. When you crush player favorites like weapons and stratagems, all in the name of some unhinged crusade to crush the meta, players see that, they remember that. They feel that you are not listening, that your calls for feedback are just hollow and they're lip service, because what they want is more of what Helldivers was at launch. Raw, unfiltered, chaotic mayhem. And you, Arrowhead, seem to have dreams of a sweatfest milsim in space where players should always feel overwhelmed and they should always be underpowered. You know, I don't know. I'm not a developer. I have no background in that field, but just thinking logically here, and I just don't get it. You've got millions of players over here saying, this is what we want, and if you give it to us, we will play it in spades. And you're over here choosing to go in the opposite direction. Does Helldivers recover? It's a question I often get asked, and honestly, I don't know. If they would look over those several time frames I pointed out and replicate those levels of events, maybe. But the way they're heading, more meetings, more discussions, more empty promises spread out over the next 60 days, I just don't know. I feel like this one carried on for a very long time, and I'm truly sorry about that. But the facts, that timeline, and those areas of mass player returns were important to get right. Where Arrowhead chooses to go with this is now up to them. Remember to leave me any feedback Helldivers related, and I'll do my absolute best to respond. Remember to hit subscribe and to ring that notifications bell to receive my future upload alerts. All my socials, including links to today's sources, can be found in the video description. A massive thank you to the now nearly 240,000 of you legends from across the globe that tune in daily to support me and my content. Until the next one, this is LtBuzzLitebeer, signing off.